Why airlines don't own private jet. Picture a wide-body jet sitting on the tarmac just after sunrise, engines still cooling, a faint smell of jet fuel hanging in the morning air. Heat shimmers off the turbines in slow, rippling waves. The early light catches a fuselage painted in the unmistakable colours of a national airline, the kind of livery you'd recognise from half a mile away. Up the boarding stairs, the crew walks by in that airline's uniform, sharp creases, matching scarves, the whole look. Down on the ramp, a baggage handler tosses suitcases onto a conveyor belt one after another, each one tagged with that same airline's logo, the belt groaning under the weight. Inside the terminal, a gate agent scans boarding passes printed with that same name. Everything about this scene says ownership, loudly and without hesitation. The paint, the uniforms, the names stamped across the nose of the plane, all of it points to one airline, and nobody walking past would think to question it. But somewhere far away, in an office building, most of the people boarding this flight will never see, will never even think about. There's a stack of paperwork that tells a completely different story, and the airline's name isn't anywhere on it. Not on the title, not on the registration, not anywhere. Now rewind the clock back to the earliest days of commercial flight, long before jet bridges, long before electronic ticketing, back when an airport might just be a wooden shed beside an open field. Back then, there was barely any gap between flying a plane and actually owning one. If you ran an airline in this era, you bought your aircraft outright pretty much the same way a small delivery company might scrape together its savings to buy its first truck. Cash in hand, or maybe a loan from the local bank, a handshake, and that was that. You'd fly the thing for 15, 20 years, sometimes longer, until the metal skin had gone smooth and dull from decades of wind, rain, and rough handling, and the logbooks in the cockpit were thick with grease-stained entries. Fleets were small. We're talking a handful of propeller planes, parked wingtip to wingtip along a single grass runway. Mechanics in oil-stained overalls walking between them with wrenches in hand, engines still ticking and popping as they cooled in the late afternoon air. A lot of these early carriers weren't even fully private businesses. Governments often propped them up, eager to have their own flag painted on something flying overhead, a point of national pride as much as a business. Buying a single aircraft back then was a massive expense for any airline, no question. But it was a one-time massive expense. Pay once, then let it slowly depreciate over decades of service. In a lot of ways, financing an airplane worked just like financing a freight locomotive or a cargo ship, a heavy, expensive piece of equipment bought outright and kept by the same operator for its entire working life, passed down like a family heirloom rather than swapped around. The whole concept of renting out an airplane to someone else. It barely existed. There was no real reason for the industry to invent it yet. That setup started to crack as route networks stretched further and flight schedules grew more tangled and complicated. Smaller regional carriers, along with charter operators flying sunburned vacationers down to the coast every summer and back home every fall, ran into a simple problem. They didn't need a full fleet sitting around doing nothing for half the year, taking up hangar space and racking up storage fees. So instead of buying more aircraft they didn't really need, some of them got creative. They started borrowing capacity instead of building it, chartering a whole airplane, crew included, from a bigger carrier that happened to have a spare jet sitting idle between routes. Flying someone else's machine under your own flight number with someone else's pilots in the cockpit, that was leasing in its earliest, scrappiest form, long before anyone bothered to give it a proper name. Meanwhile, the buy it and keep it model kept biting airlines hard, again and again. One bad season, a sudden drop in travel demand, or fuel prices spiking out of nowhere with no warning, and an airline could find itself stuck with a hangar full of loan-financed aircraft it could no longer afford to operate, let alone keep fueled and staffed. When those airlines went under, the banks and lenders behind them often ended up owning planes they never wanted, had no use for, and had absolutely no intention of flying themselves. Those repossessed jets just sat there on the tarmac, windows fogged over, paint fading in the sun, gathering dust with no buyer in sight for months at a time. And out of that mess, a quiet, improvised little business started taking shape, one built entirely around moving aircraft from failed airlines toward operators who actually needed the capacity and were willing to pay for it. Then two shocks hit the industry almost back to back within just a few years of each other, and that improvised repossession habit turned into something much bigger, a real, permanent, structured business model. First, fuel prices spiked hard across the globe, and almost overnight, operating costs that used to be predictable for years at a time became almost impossible to plan around. At the same time, governments on both sides of the Atlantic started loosening their grip on who could fly where and at what price, prying open markets that had been tightly controlled for decades and unleashing a wave of fresh, aggressive competition. Airlines suddenly needed to grow their fleets fast to chase promising new routes before a rival got there first, or shrink them just as fast the moment a route quietly stopped working out. Owning every single aircraft outright, locking up that much cash for that long, was way too rigid for that kind of constant back and forth. So a new kind of company stepped into the gap left behind. These firms bought planes straight from the manufacturers, sometimes whole rows of identical airframes, lined up nose to tail on the factory apron, fresh paint still drying under the sun, and then leased them out to multiple airlines scattered across different countries, usually for a fixed stretch of years before the contract came up for renewal. Because they were placing such massive combined orders, buying in bulk the way a wholesaler might, these leasing companies could negotiate far better prices than any single mid-sized airline buying on its own ever could hope to. They also took on the risk that a plane might lose value or quietly fall out of fashion as newer models arrived, and they handled the headache of lining up the next operator the moment one lease ran out. For an airline, that meant flying modern, up-to-date jets without tying up the kind of enormous capital that owning a whole fleet outright would otherwise demand. That arrangement, born out of crisis, is basically still the exact logic running the entire industry today, decades later. Leasing companies now own something like half of the world's commercial jet fleet, and yet almost none of their names would ring a bell for the average person walking through an airport terminal, scrolling on their phone, waiting to board. Say an airline wants to launch a new budget route or swap out an aging aircraft type for something newer and more fuel efficient. It doesn't need to scrape together hundreds of millions of dollars in cash before that first flight ever lifts off the runway. It just signs a lease. The jet that shows up is built to the exact same global engineering and safety standards as every other aircraft of its type, down to the smallest bolt and rivet, and it rolls straight into a repaint hangar, an enormous echoing space lit by rows of overhead lights, where workers in coveralls sand down the old livery, mask off the windows with plastic sheeting and tape, and spray on a fresh coat of colour before a single passenger ever steps on board. That standardization is really the quiet engine driving this whole system. A particular aircraft model handles the same way in the cockpit, trains pilots the same way in the simulator, and clears the exact same safety certifications, no matter which airline happens to be flying it that particular year. Which means one physical airframe can hop between carriers, even across continents, with little more than a new paint job and a fresh set of seat covers. Leasing also lets an airline's fleet breathe along with demand growing fast during a tourism boom, shrinking quietly the moment a route stops paying for itself, while the leasing company builds its entire business around just one thing: keeping aircraft in the air under contract somewhere on the planet almost every single hour of every single day, never sitting idle for long. A few details about this whole system still catch even frequent flyers off guard, the kind of thing that sounds almost made up until you check it. A single physical aircraft, the very same airframe, can spend a decade flying for some budget carrier on one continent, then turn up years later wearing completely different colours and a completely different name on the tail, flying for a totally unrelated airline thousands of miles away on the other side of the world, and through all of that, it never actually changed legal owners. Not once. It couldn't because it never belonged to either airline to begin with. And some of these leasing firms quietly control more jets, more total aircraft, than any single airline on Earth, despite owning not one airport gate, not one ticket counter, not a single mile of runway, not even a logo most people would recognize. So the next time a jet taxis past the window with a familiar logo stretched across its fuselage, glinting in the sun, remember that the paint is really just telling a story about branding, not about who actually owns the thing rolling down that runway.